It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Purist coming to you from Baltimore. Conservative billionaire Sebastian Pinera won Chile's presidential runoff election with a solid majority of 54.7% on Sunday. His Socialist Party challenger, Alejandro Guillier, immediately conceded the election and wished Pinera good luck. Leading up to the vote, polls indicated that the race would be far closer. The most surprising aspect of this presidential election happened in the first round when Beatriz Sanchez, the candidate of a leftist coalition of parties, won 20% of the vote, far more than any had predicted. Joining me now to analyze election results is Rene Rojas. He is a visiting assistant professor of sociology at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Welcome, Rene.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Rene, first, why did the Chileans vote for conservative billionaires such as Pinera instead of supporting Alejandro Guillier?
I think there are two things that need to be pointed out. The vote for Pinera, in my opinion, doesn't indicate that there is a large or vast majority of Chileans who support a right-wing agenda. On the other hand, a vote against, or what seems to be a majority vote against Guillier, the center-left candidate, doesn't imply that most Chileans are against a progressive reform agenda. I think that what happened was, given these two options, which represent largely two ends of a very tight consensus that has existed since Chile returned to democracy, at the elite official level, right? A consensus around market reforms. Given those two choices, Chileans didn't feel very excited to come out and vote for Guillier. In fact, one might say he kind of lost votes if you take into account all the center-left votes that occurred in the first round. Whereas the typical voter who votes for the center-right did come out and vote, wanting, an alternative to the center-left government policies, which had, been in place under Bachelet for the last 4 years and really have been dominant in Chilean politics since 1990.
Right. Now, Alejandro Guillier, he, of course, had promised to continue the legacy of the outgoing president, Michelle Bachelet, who had made a lot of progressive moves. I mean, she made university education cheaper for many Chileans and strengthened unions, legalized abortion in the country, which is a difficult thing to do in Latin America. In spite of all of this, he was rejected as her successor. Why?
Well, I think it's precisely because of the nature of the reforms and the limits to the reforms that Bachelet was able to carry out during these past 4 years. Bachelet came into office, again, 4 years ago, really on almost a crest of popular mobilizations, which the country hadn't seen in over 30 years. It was spearheaded by the student movement in 2011, which just turned into a massive, massive protest movement, and then was followed by other mass mobilizations. Labor was revitalized. There were new strikes and labor protests, as well as popular rebellions against, or I should say, for environmental rights, mass mobilization recently against the privatization of pensions. So all these things were had put reform on the agenda and were pressuring Bachelet to actually carry out quite extensive reforms. Rather, her reforms were perceived to be mild by these new movement actors. They were thought to not go far enough. And so, though she was able to carry out tax reform, education reform, and political electoral reforms, right? Again, these were deemed to be quite mild and not go far enough. I think that while the average voter in Chile acknowledges that these reforms were carried out. Really, the story of these elections is the discontent, I mean, the dissatisfaction that she did not go far enough. I think that's what explains the weak turnout for Guille in the second round, and the strong turnout for the Frente Amplio, the broad left front in the first round.
Right, and Sebastian Pinera, the new president-elect, of course, is going to introduce perhaps totally different kind of reforms in the country, being that he's a conservative candidate, and also that he actually ruled the country. He was president from 2010 to 2014 and is a billionaire, comes from that class of elite rule in Chile. Tell us who he is and what he stands for, what his politics are.
Yeah, well, as you said, Sebastian Pinera is really the top 0.001%, right, in economic terms. He is the very summit of the business class in Chile. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that he represents capital right now. But at the same time, there's some things that are worth pointing out. First of all, the center-left coalition that ruled 20 years prior to him also defended the interests of the same class. There's just no doubt about it. Under the Concertación, as it was called, the coalition that were dominated by socialists and Christian Democrats, Chile became one of the friendliest countries for business, one of the most unequal societies in Latin America and in the world over. So I think there's not too much difference there between the policies that he enacted his first term and that we can expect from him now, and the center-left coalitions that ruled most recently, currently under Bachelet. I think it's noteworthy that when he governed last from 2010 to 2014, prior to Bachelet, he really didn't carry out a lot of conservative pro-market reforms, that would have been much different than what the Concertación had done. Interestingly, this is the second time that Bachelet hands over power to Pinera. And I think largely it's because people recognize there's not much of a difference and they want some kind of change. There are not many options out there. So, and this time they voted for him. Now, his recent remarks as he campaigned for the runoff election also demonstrated that he's very aware that he cannot roll back the reforms that, even the mild reforms that Bachelet was able to implement. In fact, the reading that he came away with of the first round, which I think was the correct reading, was that most Chileans wanted to push further, wanted more, not radical, certainly more profound reforms. And he campaigned as if he were the candidate of continuity, who would kind of tweak some reforms. He wouldn't roll them back. He wouldn't also push them to the extreme, but that he was the candidate of continuity. It was quite interesting how his rhetoric changed during the last few weeks.
What's his background? How did he become a billionaire? And how will that influence what he might do when he gets into office in March?
Well, he represents the new crop of oligarchs that emerged in Chile under the dictatorship, which was from 1973, beginning with the Pinochet coup that toppled the socialist government, Allende's government, all the way to 1990. There was really a free-for-all where new business elites and clans really benefited hugely from the privatizations of state industries. And overnight, many of these people became just ridiculously wealthy. Pinera represents that process of privatization, that transfer of wealth to this new hyper elite business class in Chile. So that's how he amassed his wealth. And he will govern in the interest of that class. But again, it's really worth underscoring that that is exactly what the center-left coalition did beginning in 1990. It governed to defend and promote the interests of business elites. And so while in person, he embodies this class, I think in government, we shouldn't expect too much of a difference between what he will do and what the Concertación, the center-left governments, did up until now. Largely, he represents, I think, the kind of right the right-wing end of that fairly narrow consensus that emerged and was consolidated over the last 30 years.
Right. And Rene, you mentioned the more surprising result happened during the first round of voting last November when Beatriz Sanchez, a candidate of left-wing parties, won 20% of the vote, just 2 points short of making the runoff vote herself. Why did the left do so well? And then what were they campaigning for? And where will they stand when Pinera takes office?
Yeah, this is the key. I think this is the big takeaway from these elections, right? The emergence of a new left alliance, which established itself on the political scene, something that we had not seen since before the dictatorship. So let me start by saying a bit about who or what this new coalition is, what it stands for, how it was, and then I'll go on to how it was able to have such a good showing in the first round, and finally I'll cover what we can expect for them under Pinera's presidency. The Frente Amplio, the Broad Front, as it's called, right, was only just formed in January of this year, and it was an effort to bring together new left parties and new social movements that emerged during this wave of mobilizations, the cycle of protest that I described earlier, beginning really very, very forcefully in 2011 with the student movement. Those movements generated new small left parties, pretty radical parties. Many of them consider themselves libertarian socialist, autonomist of some sort, yet with a clear orientation toward influencing and eventually taking state power through elections. And so these are small parties that emerged from the student movement largely and other mobilizations that occurred since then. They also brought together some of the old small fragments of the radical left that had not been able to gain any traction over the last 30 years. And they decided to finally compete in these elections on a more coherent and cohesive platform. Now, they were largely able to do this because one of the outcomes of the student mobilizations was that many leaders of the movement were elected to Congress in 2013. So from this pulpit that a couple of them had, they were able to constantly criticize the weakness of the reforms, constantly put out positions that were further to the left, galvanize public opinion, so that when the election, it was time for the election, right, there was a big chunk of the electorate that recognized what they stood for, who they were, and actually sympathized with this version of more radical reforms. And they went through a primary process. They selected, or I should say in the primaries, they elected Beatriz Sanchez, who's kind of a personality from the media. She's a radio talk show host. Interestingly, she was the former colleague in radio of Guillet, the person, the center-left official candidate in the elections. But as I said, their message was able to resonate with large sectors of the population who've just completely fed up with this consensus, this neoliberal consensus between the center-left and the center-right. And again, surprising everyone, they took 1/5 of the vote and came, as you said, very close, about 130,000 votes shy of actually passing on to the runoff election.
In the early 2000s, voter turnout was in the
Sure.
80% range, but recently it has dropped to 50% in the last, I guess, 18 years. How do you explain this?
It's very simple. Over the course of those years, voting became something that was no longer compulsory. It used to be mandated by law that everyone had to vote. So you had artificially high turnout rates. Once voting was no longer compulsory, as I said, people who are very, very fed up with the way things have gone since redemocratization 30 years back, they just stopped voting. And so since then, we've had American, U.S. style voter turnout rates hovering around 50% or even lower. And that's what we saw in these elections as well. There was just a slight bump from the first round of elections to the runoff elections. One would have thought that given the importance of these elections, right, that more people would come out to vote. But in fact, it didn't happen. There were still below, half, or there were over half of voters who stayed home.
Rene, when there's compulsory voting requirement, does that tend to favor the left or the right or center?
It's interesting. At least over the last few elections in Chile, I don't think it has favored one camp over the other. I think largely the distribution of votes has remained the same. I think had voting been compulsory this time around with a new leftist option on the table, we might have seen different results. But the key is that prior to these elections, there hadn't been a third independent left option. So we had, you don't see any difference in voter distribution reflected pre and post electoral changes.
All right, Rene, I thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll keep an eye on this, as I am sure you will too. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.